Everybody, welcome back to another video. So you already know where I'm going with this. NVGs in this game could be great and it could be absolutely terrible, and we're going to get into why this could be. But before that, I just need to briefly touch on why people think this could be good. There's been recent talk about night-themed maps in Battlefield 6. Night combat brings an instant fantasy with pitch-black combat, silhouettes, tracer rounds, and the quiet tension of uncertain sightlines. NVGs are the perfect combination to that idea. A tool that reshapes how players move, aim, and survive. On paper, it sounds like Battlefield reaching for atmosphere again. Night maps would naturally pull gameplay toward spatial awareness, sound, and coordinated movement. That shift alone might be an interesting change, especially with how that shift has been handled before in past experiments with night maps. That being said, Battlefield has shown what its NVGs already look like, and the result feels a lot closer to a visual filter than a physical piece of equipment. Instead of restricted vision, depth distortion, and peripheral loss, the image reads like a green tinted filter laid across the screen. That presentation removes weight and all realism from the mechanic. It feels like a gimmick and it looks like shit. NVGs should feel intrusive, demanding constant trade-offs rather than this clean upgrade. Real night vision changes how players interpret space. Corners are confined, movement blurs, and spatial awareness is reduced. Battlefield's version smooths all those edges away, leaving combat largely unchanged, aside from some color grading. In a competitive multiplayer environment, that kind of presentation flattens everything. Tension's gone, the tool stops influencing player decisions and starts functioning as a visual preference toggle. If NVGs fail to meaningfully alter player behavior, night maps basically turn into Modern Warfare 2's multiplayer. The fantasy collapses. The feature loses its reason to exist. NVGs demand friction, meaning slower tactical gameplay. That kind of gameplay cannot coexist with the fast-paced nature of the launch maps. So to achieve that friction in Battlefield, you need to create larger, open environments. Battlefield 4 provides a pretty decent blueprint with its Night Ops variant of Zavod 311. That map worked because it preserved spatial understanding while recontextualizing player behavior. Sightlines mattered, traversal slowed down naturally, and the atmosphere justified the mechanical shift. The Dark also opens up the map for some really interesting dynamic opportunities, offering some creative light sources. You could shoot out the lights to darken areas. Headlights from vehicles would also work. Players didn't have NVGs here, so they had to rely on scopes, flashlights, and flares, or turn on a generator to activate a spotlight. Ultimately, the experiment worked because it respected scale and gave night combat a defined home. Testing night versions of Siege of Shanghai also showed similar potential, though the complexity of vertical combat introduced problems. Even then, both maps shared a common trait. They were expansive, readable, and built with enough room for night combat to breathe, and those contributions allowed players to adapt rather than panic. I also don't want DICE to be lazy and just reuse an existing map as a nighttime version. You've already remade maps, and that's starting to piss the community off. The Empire State Snow reskin and repeating that approach with night themes would signal you're creatively tapped out. NVGs deserve a purpose-built environment. One map, at minimum, designed around darkness as a core theme. That being said, this is still a very unique challenge for Battlefield, since it's always had problems with night maps. From Bad Company 2 to the more recent games, darkness was mostly cosmetic. Players quickly learned that you could change brightness, turning night combat into standard engagements. So the atmosphere existed, yet the mechanics never followed through. Battlefield 3 continued that trend. Night sequences looked dramatic, leaned on a heavy blue tint at times, and didn't really feel like night maps. And player behavior barely shifted. Suppressors, flashlights, and optics existed, yet none of them meaningfully changed or controlled the flow of combat. Across generations, the problem basically remained the same. Battlefield painted the night, but the night never pushed back. None of the maps truly felt like night maps, and darkness became something the player would bypass rather than respect. There's also a ton of references out there games which use NVGs in their campaigns to reshape gameplay in meaningful ways. Modern Warfare 2019 Clean House is the clearest example of that. Or that Bin Laden-style Insurgency. It treats night vision as a mechanical constraint. Movement slows down naturally, there's an emphasis on slower, tactical gameplay. Sound becomes critical, every doorway feels dangerous. That limited field of view forces players to clear rooms deliberately, rewarding patience. Peripheral vision is also reduced, and you can't aim down sights as a mechanical penalty. In that context, equipment feels like something you manage, not just some filter you enable. That tension, however, doesn't translate into COD's fast-paced multiplayer mayhem. NVGs are reduced to a meaningless overlay, and Battlefield is starting to look a lot closer to Modern Warfare 2's night vision for some reason. Games like Squad and Arma 3 embraced friction. Night vision narrows situational awareness, distorts depth, and introduces vulnerability when exposed to bright light. Players communicate more, rely on spacing, they plan routes carefully. These games allow darkness to dictate the tempo. The result is tension that emerges from uncertainty. NVGs become a responsibility, shaping how squads move and engage across the map. Medal of Honor Warfighter, Insurgency Sandstorm, Escape from Tarkov, and even the older Splinter Cell games follow similar principles. NVGs should reduce clarity, constrain peripheral vision, and also demand slower, methodical gameplay. Combat becomes awkward, reinforcing the idea that night fighting is not just fast-paced combat with green optics. They accept that night vision should inconvenience the player to elevate the realism. Battlefield has access to all these lessons. The question is whether they're willing to let night combat breathe instead of forcing it to sprint. I've said this many times. Battlefield is an open sandbox game, but BF6 favors smaller, condensed maps, so it misses out on that much needed space for NVGs to work. Night vision should basically push gameplay towards slower movement, cautious angles, and deliberate engagement timing. Battlefield traditionally thrives on momentum, wide open environments, combined arms gameplay. Those two philosophies can coexist, though only within carefully controlled spaces. High-octane infantry choke points and dense urban maps would amplify confusion once visibility drops. Explosions wash out contrast, muzzle flashes overwhelm vision, and constant motion strips away the tactical rhythm NVGs depend on. Instead of tension, players experience sensory overload. Instead of strategy, they default to hip firing and spamming. The mechanic basically becomes a liability at that point. So essentially, you need to create a bespoke map, preferably a lightly wooded terrain with some industrial buildings, maybe an abandoned train station or airport, some kind of urban spaces offering artificial light. You could also get really creative with the light sources as well. So maybe you could start a wildfire with a massive detonation, and that would set a portion of the environment on fire as some kind of massive levolution event, making it harder to use NVGs. Maybe reintroduce flares, give us something we haven't seen before. And you need to create the proper mechanics for NVGs to work. For example, you could press the up button on your keyboard or D-pad or whatever the fuck you play on, and it would show the animation of pulling the goggles down. Peripheral vision is lost, sightlines are narrow, but you can see in the dark. That's the trade-off. So let scale support the mechanic. Slower pacing needs breathing room, longer sightlines, and space to disengage. Without that, night combat risks feeling exhausting rather than immersive. So like I said, the series has struggled with this tactical depth before, and they still have trouble sustaining it across a multiplayer ecosystem, and it remains to be an unsolved challenge. So whether or not they can solve that challenge depends on whether or not they get their finger out. But that's going to do it for this one, guys. See you in the next one.